Okay, I'm excited to be here with you all today. And the title of my presentation is Your Eyes Are Your Breadwinners, So Protect Them, Goggles, Safety Work, and the Prevention of Industrial Blindness, 1900 to 1940s. So I'm just gonna jump right in with my argument and then sort of talk about how I see this playing out. In this paper, I look at how two progressive era movements, the safety first movement, which many of you may be more familiar with, intersected with the emergent national movement for the blind. The movement for the blind had two primary goals. One was promoting the welfare of the blind through jobs and rehabilitation. And then their second aim was preventing or eliminating future causes of blindness. In this presentation, I look at industrial eye accidents. To accomplish this task, I take as my case study a technology critical to the prevention of eye accidents in the industrial workspace, goggles. I suggest that the initial adoption and successful stabilization of this technology relied on an embodied rhetoric about the innate dependency of blind Americans. To encourage the adoption of protective goggles by reluctant working class Americans, safety engineers plastered signs across the shop floor asking the workforce, would you rather be begging on the street sightless instead? However, as I will argue, it also discouraged many employers from hiring people with disabilities, especially those with ocular abnormalities. Here, I hope to put the history of disability, the history of the senses, and the history of medicine in conversation. I hope to show how, through goggles, how a commitment to particular historically situated assumptions about sight and ability has shaped and been shaped by the industrial workplace and the citizens included or not included therein. So the two key organizations, I guess three key organizations that I look at in my project is the National Committee for the Prevention of Blindness, which was a part of the national movement to improve the welfare of the blind. And then the National Safety Council and the American Safety Museum, which were a part of the Safety First movement. After securing financial support from the Rockefeller and Russell Sage Foundations, the National Committee for the Prevention of Blindness was established in New York City on January 1st, 1915. Their explicit goal was, quote, to preserve the precious gift of sight and to avert the great calamity of blindness, end quote. In the early years, the National Committee really saw themselves as building from the ground up a nationwide movement for the conservation and preservation of vision among laypersons, public health reformers, industrialists, and government officials. However, they knew that in order to really create and build a movement, they needed to partner with other organizations, other committees that were also advocated, that were also interested in preventing blindness. And they found that in the Safety First movement. Between 1916 and 1917, the National Committee for the Prevention of Blindness formed a partnership with the National Safety Council, which was established in 1913, and the American Museum of Safety, which was established in 1908 to prevent eye accidents in these industries. Initially, the American Museum of Safety in particular reached out to the National Committee for the Prevention of Blindness because they wanted to conduct more comprehensive research on the frequency of eye accidents in industrial work environments. And as many of you may know, there were lots of studies and research projects going on at this time, notably Crystal Eastman's study about the prevalence of industrial accidents. But what the American Museum of Safety and the National Safety Council really became concerned with was eye accidents as they were increasing. They suggested that they needed to conduct more specific research into the prevalence of eye accidents. This study became known as the Buffalo Study, and it really did bring national awareness to the nature and prevalence of eye accidents. But more instructively, the Buffalo Study also brought to the fore emerging debates on safety work, particularly whether accident reduction should be achieved by changing worker deportment through protective gear like goggles, or by the companies spending more money and time installing safety guards on the machines themselves. In ideal situations, the authors of the report suggested that screen guards, for example, and goggles would go hand in hand. But that in practice, they sort of acquiesced and said that there was none which had greater possibilities for saving sight than the goggle. Goggles took on, as I'm arguing, a newfound importance between 1915 and 1925, which is not altogether unsurprising as many of the initial safety work efforts, especially in large manufacturing companies, were more centered on engineering revision than individual worker behavior. Yet as employers pushed this protective eyewear on their employees, they began to encounter unexpected resistance from their employees, which, if many of us are familiar with the railroad industry, this shouldn't have been surprising, as the railroad industry experienced reluctance from their workers to wear goggles in the late 19th century, as Mark Aldrich, among John William Sirleaf, has pointed out in their work. At the 6th Annual Safety Conference, W.R. Roach from Dodge Brothers asked his fellow safety engineers and managers, quote, Are you getting your workmen to wear goggles? What are you doing to educate those workmen? The response was equivocal. People said, we have this problem. I think, quote, every factory has it. Employers largely ascribe this resistance to either, quote, a stubborn disregard for the value of the workman's eyesight, or else the goggle itself does not successfully accomplish its purpose, end quote. Answering his own problematic, he suggested that either you force the employee against his will to wear the glasses, or you convince him of two things. One, the gravity of accidents, which may result in the loss of one or both eyes, or that he can and very probably will have an eye accident unless he wears goggles. Nutt continued, quote, many times a man recognizes the danger, but seems to think that it applies only to the other fellow, and so he entirely overlooks personal application. Nutt also admitted that ultimately forcing a man to wear goggles was never permanently successful because a safety idea cannot be effective while it is being combated by those it is meant to protect. Nutt was not alone or exceptional in imagining that an appeal to the personal benefit of the typical working man might remedy the problem of goggle compliance facing so many manufacturers. He admitted that this idea of appealing to the personal came to him as he was walking down a street in Montreal when coming toward him were, quote, two robust Canadian soldiers between whom a lady was walking. She was holding the hand of each. As the men got closer, Nutt noticed they were both blind. And it was in that moment, appealing to his own emotional proclivities, that he realized all their lives they would be dependent on someone for guidance. He thought to himself, how horrible to deprive a man of his most precious possession and leave him helpless and dependent. We see through Nutt's admission, I argue, how blindness, both the actual injuries workmen sustained on the job and rhetoric about what a life about being blind might signify was central to safety campaigns about eye protection in manufacturing environments in the early to mid 20th century. The Safety Bulletin Board, with its bulletins and posters, was a primary vehicle for conveying safety truths and was viewed by many safety engineers as a powerful educative agent. To aid the National Safety Council, the National Committee for the Prevention of Blindness devoted a significant amount of their time and resources in the years between 1916 and 1920 to the creation and distribution of educational materials, printing nearly 50,000 sets of large posters for bulletin board use. And I'm gonna now show you what a couple of those posters looked like. Relying on these posters that proliferated between bulletin boards, safety leaflets, and plant magazines, we can perceive how blindness was used to motivate workmen to protect their eyes and wear their goggles. Far from neutral, the rhetoric and images in these bulletins signified in the progressive era essentially that, quote, your eyes were your breadwinner. That was a common quote on a lot of these leaflets. However, at the same time that these advertisements and warnings reflected popular beliefs, they also worked to re-entrench those beliefs deeper into the factory floor, into the own body minds of the workmen, strengthening a deterministic relationship between vision and dependence, suggesting that without vision, one has no access to the labor force. And this is something I can talk about more in questions about this relationship between economic citizenship and visual citizenship. Relying on cultural conceptions of blindness to basically scare men into wearing protective eyewear not only reinscribed and stabilized a symbiotic relationship between blindness and dependency, but it also worked to place the burden of responsibility and accident blame on the individual worker itself, shifting the attention away from the precarious, disabling work environment. A critical strategy employed by safety engineers was not only using an elusive imaginary life as a blind person, but to use an actual workman who had been injured or not injured to motivate employees to wear their goggles and protect their eyes. At the 7th Safety Congress, Chief Factory Inspector for the state of Missouri said, quote, when an accident occurs, you should post a notice at the place where the accident happened, telling the nature of the accident, to whom it occurred, and why it should not have occurred. When Frank Murdoch lost his right eye due to flying metal, a note was posted on the factory floor that said, quote, while clipping steel at his bench, Frank Murdoch lost his right eye by being struck by flying metal. He had been supplied with goggles and told to use them, but it is likely that when the accident occurred, they were in his pocket, end quote. We see here how safety engineers use the current bodies of men who are blind in the industry to show how they cause their own disability by not wearing glasses. They took a chance. Taking another instance, a former working man who opened his keynote address at the 1917 National Safety Engineering Conference by saying, quote, gentlemen, I am glad to see you, end quote, which according to attendees was one of the most dramatic after-dinner speeches on record. 7 words spoken by a man without inflection brought cheers and applause from the fellow audience members. Goggles enabled employers to have material proof or evidence of preventing and causing disability. And here are some other examples of how the material, the goggle itself, was used. The consequences of these educational strategies were more than just rhetorical. The decision on the part of safety engineers to not only stress goggle use as a singular method to prevent eye injuries, shaped how men who did lose their sight in industry internalized and embodied their own new ocular reality. Jerry Smith, foreman at the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, offers one example, and this is a longer quote.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. He said, quote, "One day while I was coming up the main aisle in the main shop, I saw my good friend Bob Owen attempting to sharpen a tool. Bob couldn't do it, so I went over to Bob and took the tool from him, went to the emery reel. I heard the buzz and buzz of the wheel. I saw the sparks fly and fly. And from the end of the tool, there flew a tiny sliver of steel into my eye. They took me to the emergency room, but the big eye magnet could do no good. I was blind." He said, "I didn't follow the instructions. I didn't wear my goggles. I didn't practice what I preached. I was in total blindness, darkness, and despair." Now, if you want to know what the careless chance taker means, if you want to know what blindness means, come and live with me for one day. The morning, a meager breakfast, and with a tin cup and a cane in my hand and a bunch of lead pencils and a sign that says, "Please help the blind man. I was once a skilled worker, but now I am a blind beggar," end quote. Here, the central message that emanated from the pro-goggle movement were now deeply entrenched in this man's day-to-day life. He believed that it was solely his fault that he was now in total blindness. Yet despite the impact of messages like "your eyes are your breadwinners" or "you don't want to puddle lead pencils on the street" on the actual workers' materials, bodies, and psyches, workplace norms, and rules and regulations, the evidence repeatedly suggested that such efforts were remarkably successful in accident prevention. A title ran in the Washington Post in late September 1921 claiming, quote, "Goggles were an effective preventative against blindness in industry," end quote. Goggles were here to stay. Unless one think that I'm suggesting that goggles operated in isolation or were stagnant, the second half of this paper that I am not presenting today, I go on to talk about how they became, along with the industrial eye exam, took on new meaning beyond just safety protection. As we move into the 20s and 30s, we see a shift from prevention to conservation, and there was a larger infrastructure that was stabilized in the workplace. So we saw in this paper how efforts to standardize and institutionalize a seemingly bromatic tool like goggles inscribe the superiority of seeing in individual employees and the broader company, while also reinforcing the idea that loss of vision was a feature to be avoided at all costs. Thank you.